Hello, you all. Welcome to Women in Art and Art History. Why do we need a class specifically about women? And how are we going to approach this subject? I'm going to allow the Guerrilla Girls, presented here on this slide as women wearing gorilla masks, to explain. So the Guerrilla Girls are women artists, late 80s. And they noticed, they looked around and they were like, it's really hard. It's hard to be a woman in the art world. They're looking around at the museums. There's no art by women on the walls. They're, applying to galleries. They're not getting into galleries. And it's frustrating. So they decided to anonymously, because they don't want to lose any more work, right? Anonymously call out the art world for its lack of representation. This is their most famous work. So they're, 80s artists. So this artwork would appear as posters, also on the sides of a bus, billboards, that kind of thing. So it's this advertisement art. So this particular one, right? Do women have to be naked to get into the Met Museum? So the Metropolitan Museum of Art, that's the #1 art museum in America. The only one that might sort of beat it out in the world is the Louvre in Paris. So this is not just your everyday museum down the street. This is the museum. Goes on to say less than 5% of the artists in the modern art sections are women. Now, as you all know, modern art, if there's going to be women, it will be in the modern art section. That's when you have Georgia O'Keeffe and Frida Kahlo and those artists emerge. Before that, you definitely aren't seeing any women. So they went to the section where there should be women, right? But less than 5% of the artists in that section were women. 95% were men. That is wild. But 85% of the nudes are female. So what they're saying is women are not in any way represented by their talents at the Met Museum. So you have male artists painting female nude bodies, and that's what's on the walls. There's nothing wrong with female nudes, but there's something really wrong if that's all that's there. So today, last I looked, like a couple years ago maybe, the percentage has gotten worse. Now it's less than 4%, but there are more male nudes. that percentage is, that's not what we wanted, right? that's not what we were asking for. So there's more male nudes, so there's less of a percentage of female nudes. It's wild. It's wild. But, so yeah, they're calling them out. So they're very kind of snarky, right? They've got a sense of humor. This poster says, when racism and sexism are no longer fashionable, what will your art collection be worth? And if you go on, it says, for the $17.7 million you just spent on a single Jasper Johns painting, you could have bought at least one work by all of these women and artists of color. All of them. So can you imagine being an art collector? And you have the choice, you all. I mean, how many are listed here? There's tens. I mean, there's probably 100. There's probably, I don't know, 1, 2, 3. There's so many great works of art listed here. You could have all of those or one Jasper Johns. It's crazy. So that's how less, not only are women not allowed to be in the art world, as easily, but when they do make it, their artworks are literally not valued as much. Their paintings their artworks do not sell for as much. The Guerrilla Girls also did this really cool thing where they would go into these museums like the Whitney Museum, really famous one, and they would critique the museum. They would be like, you don't have that many artworks by women and people of color. And by the way, you've never had a woman director or person of color as a director of your museum. And by the way, you don't have any people of color on your staff, and you got problems. From that description of the work of the Guerrilla Girls, I hope you've gathered, 1, why it's important to discuss women in art and art history. There's a lot of inequality happening. And 2, how we can approach the subject. We can use critical thinking to pull apart the misconceptions and inequality surrounding women in art and art history. You heard me use the phrase art world a lot just now. Art world refers to the artists that make art, the people that view and collect that work, the places that exhibit art like museums and galleries, and folks that write and publish work about art. This is our course description and competencies. This course provides a basic overview of the visual art, artistic contributions, and lives of artists who identify as women from a global perspective. Global perspective is in bold there because we want to look at a variety of world cultures. Once again, trying to be more equitable and moving away from the traditional Eurocentric methods. We'll talk more about that in a minute. We'll be analyzing and critiquing works of art from women artists using art terms that we're going to learn. And we'll be exploring this topic thematically. Those themes include intersectional feminism, religion, politics, family structure, sexuality, and technology. Our course format. So each week we will learn about one contemporary woman artist. So what is a contemporary artist? That's an artist who is living and working today. We're going to look at their biography, their geography, their background and context, influences, the medium that they chose, their style, themes of their work, and more. And we're going to learn through lecture videos like this, imagery videos, readings, and the occasional podcast. We're going to process what we learn through our discussion board activities, which will include field experiences, hands-on activities. We're going to be doing some art making, exploring some creativity here, writing, and short quizzes. Those short quizzes are there just to assess that you have read and listened to and learned from all of the assigned material. So if we're learning about one contemporary woman each week, right, like, well, what about the art history? We're able to find art historical connections within the background of contemporary artists, whether that's their biography or geography, etc., and I will present that to you. And that's exciting because it sort of proves how influential the art of the past is on artists of the present. Now I need you to pause this lecture video and watch Rethinking Art History class. This video should be located right under the lecture video on Blackboard, just like in this screenshot. Go watch that and then come back to this lecture video. I love art history, right? I have a bachelor's and master's degree in art history, and I've been teaching it for over 10 years. Give me the dark room and slideshow. But the traditional methods of studying art history can be difficult for students. Typically, art history is discussed within certain time periods or movements in chronological order. You see that depicted here in Lauren Monk's work, History of Art Timeline. It's a lot to memorize. It can also be problematic because the history of art is often presented from that Eurocentric perspective. So in this class, we're going to take a different approach. It will be non-linear, meaning it's going to jump around in time, and non-comprehensive. Now let's talk about that Eurocentric perspective that's so prevalent and harmful when we talk about art. You see on this map that Europe, countries like France, Italy, Germany, and North America have big stars, and the rest of the world has smaller and smaller dots. This demonstrates that most of the artworks we typically discuss come from Europe and America. But art is integral to humanity and found in every culture, society, and gender. You just have to look really hard for it sometimes, unfortunately. Also notice the arrow pointing straight through the timeline from BC to present. The reason art is typically viewed from a Eurocentric perspective is because of colonization. As you can see from this map, Europe has colonized, controlled, or influenced most of the world at different points in time. Colonization is when a group establishes control over areas or peoples to advance themselves. You can imagine how this dominant force can affect how art is made, viewed, and discussed. For example, this is an account of the Benin Punitive Expedition of 1897, pictured here on the right, from the National Museum of African Art. James Phillips, an official in Britain's Niger Coast Protectorate, led an unarmed trading expedition to Benin City in January of 1897. This was to prevent the British party from interfering with annual royal rituals. Some chiefs, acting against Oba Avranramwen's wishes, and Oba is a king, so we're talking about the king of Benin, which is a country in Africa, ordered the expedition attacked. 6 British officials and almost 200 African porters were killed. So this is a moment in time, a moment in history. Britain responded immediately, mounting a so-called punitive expedition to capture Benin. The palace was burned and looted in February of 1897, and the Oba king was exiled. To break the power of the monarchy, the British confiscated all of the royal treasures, giving some to individual officers, but taking most to auction in London to pay for the cost of the expedition. The looted objects eventually made their way into museum and private collections around the world. The objects remain contested today, with some Nigerian scholars and museum professionals and Royal Court of Benin advocating for their return. So Benin is a country in Africa, but it's also a kingdom, I believe, in Nigeria. The Kingdom of Benin. On the right of this slide, you see artworks and objects taken out of context and displayed for a Eurocentric gaze at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. These works may have once been used for those annual royal or sacred rituals mentioned earlier, but now they are static display objects. And you could go to this museum and even admire this section and how it's displayed, not knowing its background because we are so heavily influenced by European traditions. This is an image of protest in what looks like the Egyptian section. How this relates to our class. This map represents the geographical focus of this class, which you can see is much more equitable. Big red stars everywhere. So imagine all the different types of artists from all over the world that you'll be exposed to. This class attempts to decolonize women in art and art history. Decolonize means to free from the cultural or social effects of colonization, to eliminate colonial influences. Notice the red arrow is going back and forth through time, representing how we'll be moving back and forth through time in this class. The video you watched used the term methodology. This is the system or how we'll be approaching women in art and art history. These bubbles spell out our methodology. So we're taking on a global perspective with a critical approach. We have certain themes and theories we're going to focus on. We're going to bring up stories from the past. That's our art history as they relate to the present. We care about the biographical information about these artists that we're going to look at. But we're not focused on a timeline. We're skipping around in time, and we have less of an emphasis on specific art periods and movements. Now we're going to take another pause from our lecture video and watch a few more videos that are posted in the same spot on Blackboard. These videos are: why are there so few female artists? Where are the women? Fierce women of art, and the male grays. Once you've done with these videos, come on back to this lecture. I wanted to bring up a key factor in the art history of women, which is second wave feminism. First wave feminism is considered to be the suffragist movement fighting for that right to vote. Second wave refers to women of the 1970s and the conscious raising work they did surrounding sexism, oppression, hierarchy, women's work and labor, the domestic sphere, nuclear family, and often intersected with concerns about race, class, and forms of privilege. A criticism of this wave is that it often left out that global perspective and women of color and women of non-Western countries. So as a result of this second wave, the feminist art movement occurred. And those artworks challenged male dominance in both art and society by questioning gender inequality and pushed back on assumptions about womanhood. It investigated the social and economic factors around the repression of women in art, and that is marked by Linda Notchland's essay, Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists?, which concluded that systemic barriers and social structures had kept women out of the art space, not that they lacked talent or skill or even interest in art. Here are some examples of artists during this time period. This slide shows a side-by-side of Leonardo's The Last Supper and Mary Beth Edelson's recreation of it. And what she has done with Some Living Women Artist / Last Supper is she has replaced Jesus with George O'Keeffe and the rest of the apostles with women artists. Her own words, The most negative aspect of organized religion for me was the positioning of power and authority in the hands of a male hierarchy that intentionally excluded women from access to these positions. This work gave me a double pleasure of presenting the names and faces of the many women artists who were seldom seen in the art world of 1972 as the grand subject, while spoofing male exclusivity in the patriarchy. Margaret Harrison advocated for workers and women's rights. She began researching home workers. Check out the artwork on the left. When the UK Equal Pay Act came into force in 1975, this was meant to stamp out separate, lower, rates of pay for women. Harrison worked with the National Campaign for Home Workers in London for 2 years. She interviewed several piece workers, piece, P-I-E-C-E, piece, like piece of paper, who were paid per item produced rather than per hour. The canvas includes items that they made, their production time, the selling price, and the money paid to their makers. The hands at the top symbolize the manual toil involved in piece work. Her work on the right, Good Enough to Eat, is a drawing that shows a woman in a somewhat sexual position with revealing clothing within a sandwich. She's addressing the male gaze and how it turns women into sexual objects to be consumed like you would a sandwich. Barbara Kruger is another example. On the left is a large installation with the words, "Your body is a battleground," in reference to women's reproductive rights and how that plays out in politics. The left is her work as the cover art of Miss Magazine, which is a magazine started by feminist icon Gloria Steinem, which addresses feminist rage and how it can be channeled into power. And she worked in advertising. And of course, there's a history of women's bodies being exploited in advertising. And so her artworks themselves look like advertisements. So in this particular one, untitled, Your Gaze Hits the Side of My Face, she incorporates a found image of a portrait bust in dramatic light and puts the phrase, "Your gaze hits the side of my face," down the side. So this phrase confronts the masculine probing gaze. So the male gaze being, every woman has felt it at some point in her life. And if you ask women, when's the first time something was said inappropriate to you, or when's the first time that you felt a man's eyes on you in a sexual way, they'll tell you it was when they were very young. So this artwork is about that kind of creeper stare. And in this artwork, that stare, that gaze, is being deflected by the side of a very strong stone face. And Barbara Kruger consistently uses these colors and this font. Another one of those artists that you know their work when you see it. Moving on into feminist art as academic study. So in the 1970s, at the California State University at Fresno, artists including, led by Judy Chicago, Miriam Shapiro, and others, created the first feminist art program. And it was the first time in an academic setting that there was a focus exclusively on creating an art studio that was entirely responsive to the female experience. And one of the projects that they did is called a Woman House. It was an exhibition. So it's a site-specific installation and performance space of works of art that examine themes related to identifying and overcoming patriarchal patterns of womanhood. I'll show you some images in just a moment, but imagine an actual house, right? Maybe you're in a class and you're a student and you're assigned a room or a space, and the goal is to create a work of art that is responsive to that female experience in some way. How cool. And we have here a definition of what the patriarchy is. So the patriarchy is a system of society in which men hold the power, and women and LGBTQIA plus people are largely excluded from it. So what that does is it leads to male domination in both public and private spheres, and it creates power dynamics between people of varied genders. This is Woman House. So as I mentioned, they took over a home, which is a domestic space, which at that time was considered a woman's space, a woman's realm, and she was kind of confined there. And so the artist took that domestic sphere and they were able to create installations in different rooms of that house. And you can see on the citation, all the different, women artists that were making artworks. And you can see that their approach and methods are in response to that female experience. So we have the nurturant kitchen, the upper left. And so what you have is imagery of breasts, kind of in a pattern all over the wall. And our picture is in black and white, but unless I'm mistaken, they also look like egg yolks, right? So that kind of mixture of eggs, breasts, kitchen, kind of in a pattern all over the wall there. Next to nurturing kitchen, you have crocheted womb room. So of course, the womb associated with, the biological definition of a woman. And then also that art making method, the crocheting. Typically, that is associated with women and domesticity, right? And so what's really cool about feminist artists is that they did largely reject a lot of the traditional art making methods that they had been excluded from for so long. For instance, men were the great painters, men were the great sculptors, and they were like, all right, we're going to do something completely different where there isn't this standard that we have to break into. We're doing our own thing. So then you see like installations, you see performance art, you see craft being, used, such as this crochet. So you see linen closet and ironing, of course referring to typically a woman's role in the home, doing that domestic labor. And then we have nightmare bathroom there at the bottom. Okay, so Judy Chicago, as I mentioned, really took the lead there in Fresno with this first pioneering feminist art program. She looked around, as she mentions in this video that you're about to watch, one of her main goals was to make an impact in art history, and she certainly did that. But she wanted to do things, right? She's a creator. She wanted to do things that had not been done before. And when she looked around at the history of art and the artworks that were being made, she didn't see anything that was centered on birth. And think about what a big part of life and experience, life experience that is. So she took on that subject in what she called the Birth Project in the early 1980s. But I'm going to have you all hear directly from Judy Chicago. So you can learn more about that in the separate video posted along with the others on Blackboard. So once again, go watch that short video and then come back and finish out this lecture video. This class attempts to move beyond the second wave of feminist thought. We want to go beyond white middle class, able-bodied, heterosexual representations and acknowledge intersectionality. There is a multicolored Venn diagram on this slide that shows different intersectional markers like race, disability, sexuality, gender identity. I think we're going to talk about some non-binary folks in this class as well, and nationality. So those factors can shape how an individual is perceived and the experiences that they have, which include discrimination and oppression, and that will inform the art that they create. The next 3 slides are examples of artists that do represent that new approach to looking at feminism. Sasha Huber is a Swiss Haitian artist who lives in Finland. She did a series called The First, which is a series that depicts Black people that were the first to do something. This portrait of Rosa Amelia Clay is made out of staples, which you can see if you look close. Clay was the first Black woman to gain Finnish citizenship, which perhaps Huber found compelling or could relate to as a Black woman living in Finland herself. Sonia Boyce is a British African Caribbean artist living in Britain. She was associated with the British Black Arts movement in the 80s. Her paintings often include a self-portrait, so they are personal. In her work pictured here, she ain't holding them up, she's holding on. We see the artist stoically holding up members of her family in the palm of her hands over her head. She looks at the viewer at a 2/3 angle with a resigned but tired look on her face. She uses symbols such as the black rose on her dress to represent her race and nationality, a black English rose. Roses are also symbols of beauty but have tough thorns for protection. So this work is personal but also relatable to women doing the emotional and physical labor of the family. Shazia Sikander is an Indo-Persian artist that is from Pakistan that lives in Brooklyn. Sikander studied traditional miniature painting but brings contemporary experiences to it. They also bring that tradition into other art forms such as animation, video, photography, murals, and installation work.